The anger rested in her like a dormant but wild animal, waiting to be awakened and used. Noguchi knew she had bigger things to deal with than this overblown rancher who stood fuming, his fat finger pointed at her chest. But she had more than enough from him. She took a breath and jabbed. It was a reaction more than a decision. Ackland folded, gasped, and fell to the floor. She heard the people all around step back. 2 or 3 applauded. Responsibility? Her voice sounded strange to her ears, cold and furious. Hiroki is dead, Ackland. And a big part of this shit sandwich is on your plate. If we live through this, you're going to find out what happens to people who are responsible. Ackland was still on the floor, face red, trying to catch his breath. The anger suddenly coiled back to a resting state, left her exhilarated and exhausted all at once. Ackland was an annoyance, but nothing to slow down for, like a headache. She raised her gaze and looked around at the watching crowd. The faces she saw weren't angry, just somber. Maybe Ackland wasn't quite as popular as he thought. The only important thing now was getting the job done, the job she was responsible for. Hunting down the things that had disturbed Prosperity Wells, but not simply for vengeance, for honor. Noguchi raised her voice so that everyone could hear. Weaver, you're in charge until I get back. The rest of you will follow her orders to the letter. Is that clear? A few of the ranchers nodded. It would have to do. Spanner had holstered Hiroki's revolver to a rinth-hide belt with pouches for the extra ammunition carriers. Noguchi smiled briefly at him and strapped it on without another word. No one spoke. Several of the ranchers and employees followed her down the long hall to the east lock, but she didn't have anything else to tell them. She had an idea, but the details weren't quite worked out yet. She had told Weaver the basics over the comm, so help on this end was covered. But judging from how fast Hiroki and his team had been taken out, time couldn't be wasted on planning. She'd have to play it mostly by ear. Noguchi reached the lock and peered out of the loophole window. The bike was only a few meters from the entry. The deepening dusk was deceptively peaceful looking, quiet. Roth stepped up behind her, expression set. I could come with you, she said softly. Noguchi considered it and then shook her head. No, if I don't come back, someone will have to come up with the other plans. You'll help most by staying here. Talk to Weaver, she'll fill you in. Roth nodded. Let me cover you then. Okay. I'll signal here in approximately 20 minutes. If I haven't called, weld this lock and keep a CDS going to the corporate sub-HQ. If you keep backing up and sealing the doors as you go, you might be able to hold out until they give up, or until my idea pans out. Or they get in. It didn't need to be said. Roth nodded again and shouldered her rifle. Noguchi opened the door and broke into a run into the hot night air. The pain had been flowing away for a long time. How long he didn't know, or where he was, or what exactly had happened. More than once he had risen from the dark to feel that he was still alive, still Nanku. There were straps on his body, which conjured images of a snarling dark creature in bands of Dlex. Queen, kinda Amada. He surfaced briefly, with the familiar image, and then decided to sleep a little more. He must still be unwell, although he felt that his strength had somewhat returned. The sickness was sensory. The smells in consciousness were alien, strange. The air was wrong, and he sensed no Yautja nearby. Dachande slept, but left his inner eye open and watchful. He would investigate the situation later, soon. Noguchi jumped on the bike and stabbed at the key at the same time. Her adrenaline was in overload, her breath shallow. Everything around her had slowed down, but she was at light speed. She jammed the accelerator down and flew towards the lector, free from fear. Death wasn't so scary once decided on. Noguchi didn't want to die, but the odds weren't in her favour. After seeing Hiroki's head on a spear, she had accepted the futility of the situation. She would probably die, but not without company. There was an overpass overhead, the second-story walkway between the sewage treatment plant and the main well. Noguchi floored the pedal. The shadows there were thick and secretive. She was halfway through when the dark exploded to life. The attack came from her left, a high shriek, then something big and heavy hit. The bike tipped, veered towards the wall in the dark. Claws ripped, the bike righted, and she was back in the open. The creature had fallen off the unbalanced bike. There was another shriek behind her. She got the impression of great speed from behind as the thing ran. Noguchi grabbed for the rifle on her back and circled wide. It was one of the bugs. Because everything had slowed, she saw it in perfect detail as it ran. Long black skull with razor teeth. An impossible body, segmented, black, metallic. There was only one. She flew straight at it, a part of her mind screaming at her to get away fast. She aimed the rifle. The creature's head blew apart in a spray of blood. Another jumped out from the heavy shadows, ran at her. She hit it, heard the cry of pain and rage. It clutched at the cycle, scrambled up, loomed above her. There was a meter-thick beam under the walkway, barely visible in the dark. Noguchi ducked low and flew straight at it. The bug's howl was cut short, and the bike lifted again. Noguchi circled back and headed for the ship, heart pounding. In spite of the physical reaction, she felt calm. Very awake, but not panicked. She felt in complete control. She knew exactly what she was doing. She slammed on the brakes and suddenly cried out, enraged by her own stupidity. Shit, shit, shit! Miriam Revner. She had forgotten. The comms had been out for several hours before Miriam heard the shots echo through the compound. There had been gunfire before, but it hadn't been so close. Several times she had heard weird screams, alien sounds. Miriam held the bone cutter tightly and tried to breathe deeply. She had stood by the door for what seemed like days, and she was exhausted. The patient had not regained consciousness, although his readings had jumped several times, indicating a raise of bodily functions. Increased heart rate, blood pressure, temperature. The readings could be wrong, though. Probably were. She had never seen a creature quite like it. Neither had Kaiser. Miriam closed her eyes and breathed deeper. She didn't want to think about him. Not yet. She wasn't ready to admit that she wasn't ready to grieve. The two comms in the lab were notorious for fuzzing out, sometimes for days at a time. They had never bothered getting them fixed. The lab was only a few dozen meters from the main transmitting antenna, not a hassle to walk. No one had tried to contact her, although she wouldn't know, of course. She was scared, and she missed Kazar more with every second. A hoverbike pulled up outside, and Miriam heard running footsteps. Perhaps it was Kazar. She knew it wasn't somewhere inside, even before she heard Machiko Noguchi's voice. "Dr. Revner, it's me, Machiko." Miriam grabbed the bone saw closer and went to the door. She punched the entry button and looked outside cautiously. It was the overseer. She wore a padded overall and held a rifle. Her gaze scanned from left to right as she edged into the lab, facing out. As soon as she was inside, Miriam hit the control and the door slid shut. "Machiko, I heard shooting. What happened?" The younger woman turned to face her. Miriam was struck by the changes she saw in Noguchi's cool expression. Something huge had occurred, something that had made everything different. It was in her eyes, in the set of her mouth. Things are bad, and they're about to get worse. In spite of the circumstances, Machiko Noguchi sounded calm. "Can you handle a hoverbike?" Miriam shook her head and set the cutter on a table. "No, I never learned. Kaiser was going to teach me, but we never." "Do you know how to use one of these things?" Machiko cut her off, held up the rifle she carried. "I don't have time to get you back to ops." Miriam shook her head again. Machiko handed it to her anyway and spoke quickly. "It's a semi-automatic, so it does all the work for you. Just point it at what you want to shoot and squeeze this trigger." She motioned at the crook of the rifle. "You only have 6 rounds, so don't waste any on warning shots." Miriam took the rifle hesitantly and frowned. "Ms. Noguchi, I'm a doctor, not a soldier. This isn't war," Noguchi said softly. "This is survival." Miriam felt tears in her eyes, but wasn't sure why. "Who might I be shooting at?" The words were strange in her mouth. "Your patient's brothers, or something that looks like a 2-meter-tall black insect with a banana-shaped head full of teeth," Machiko said. She walked over to the patient and the table of artifacts and picked up the odd shield that she and Hiroki had studied before. She held it up toward Miriam. "The unclassifieds that Roth brought in. Kazar's report said he thought they might transport eggs or spores to host bodies. Is it possible that when these spores grew up, they'd look like this?" She pointed at the strange animal etched into the surface. It's impossible to say, Miriam said slowly. She felt horribly confused. Why? Because I've seen some of these things tonight. There were dozens, maybe hundreds of them in the lector, and I think Ackland's rynth were infected. She paused. Or impregnated by these things, and they spread it to all of the herds of the ship. I think our two unclassifieds are connected somehow. Miriam looked at the etching and then over at the specimen strapped to the table. Not biologically, they're quite different in chemical makeup. Machiko nodded. There's no time to worry about it now anyway. She looked at the injured alien. We ought to shoot that thing, she said, but maybe we'll need it as a hostage later. She walked towards the door. What are you going to do? Noguchi turned. I have an idea or two. Listen, I want you to stay here, okay? Outside is not safe. Keep the door locked. I'll come back for you as soon as I can, but if you haven't seen me within the next hour, start thinking about how you can get to Ops. Wait until daylight, and take the rifle when you go. I'll tell the ranchers to watch for you. And she was gone, just like that. Miriam set the heavy weapon on the table and stood with her eyes closed for a moment. It was all like a dream, surreal and frightening. None of this could be happening. She looked at the alien creature on the exam table and tried to get her thoughts in order. Kazar was dead. Thinking anything else was folly. Perhaps the broken-tusked alien had something to do with it, but there was no anger in her heart, only a soft, wishful ache. It's so wasteful, she said quietly. We could learn so much from one another. There was a sudden scratching sound at the door, a sliding knock. Dr. Revner, it's me, Machiko. Why had she come back? Miriam hurried to the door. Machiko, what happened? She hit the entry control and stepped back. Words escaped. The patient. No, it was a creature like the one on the table. Miriam turned and ran, even as the armoured monster clutched for her. The weapon! Table! Trigger! She ran, but the thing screamed behind her. Too close. She was going to die.